Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon's program on reform prosecutors and the exercise of discretion. We're very fortunate to have some of the country's most thoughtful, courageous prosecutors who have weathered many storms as they attempt to exercise discretion in ways that were uncommon before they were elected. They've all been forthright, brave, pragmatic, and principled. I'm going to introduce them very briefly because you actually can scroll over their names and see their more lengthy bios because we want to spend most of our time today in discussion of the issues. So in alphabetical order, I'm thrilled to welcome our participants today, beginning with Dinah Becton, who's also known as Dinah Becton Smith. She's a trial judge, and she's currently the first female African-American who was elected district attorney in the history of Contra Costa County in California. There's a lot of C's there. Contra, I don't know how you do that. Contra Costa County, California. She was elected in June 2018. Jamila Hodge, known as Jamie, she's the director of the Reshaping Prosecution Program at the Vera Institute of Justice. She joined Vera in 2018 after serving for 12 years as an assistant United States attorney in Washington, D.C. Dan Satterberg has served in the King County Prosecutor's Office for more than 3 decades. He was first elected to lead the office in November 2007. He's one of the original reform prosecutors, even though we didn't use those terms back in 2007. And Parisa Dehghani Tafti is the Commonwealth's attorney for Arlington County and the City of Falls Church in Virginia. Parisa was first elected to a 4-year term in 2019. She has a 20-year record of criminal justice reform as an Innocence Project attorney, a public defender, and a law professor. So welcome to all of you. Here we are. It's a unique time, a unique moment for us to talk about criminal justice, to talk about reform, and not just because of COVID, George Floyd, policing, wrongful convictions, or the myriad of issues faced by the criminal legal system or the criminal justice system, whatever term you use, that it's on the front burner in many jurisdictions. We have an unprecedented number of reformers who are elected prosecutors, and the platform of most of you, the reformers among you, is to lessen the criminal justice footprint, to reduce harm to communities, notably communities of color, for past practices in charging and sentencing that has resulted in mass incarceration across the United States. And as this program, as we talk about systemic racism, and what do we do in prosecution to deal with systemic racism? We've recognized, or many of you have recognized, the need not to prosecute certain crimes, notably misdemeanors, and to look to alternatives to try to solve the underlying problems that led to the conduct that subjected people to prosecution. So instead of drug prosecutions, drug programs, treating those with mental health issues within the healthcare systems, not the criminal legal system. Public safety as a major concern of yours being redefined. Many people will say we need to change the narrative of what public safety really is. When you're thinking of criminal justice transformation, not just reform, overall engaging in harm reduction. And so the challenge, I think, and what we want to talk about today is given the discretion you have, right, as a minister of justice, to do justice, not just convict, not just to put people through a system, to engage in reform, to act in the public interest, with public safety as a major goal. You work with the police. You work with many different constituencies. There's the politics of your office because you're an elected. And you know of the many challenges, and we're going to explore those today. All right? So I think I want to start today with each of you going through, just briefly, letting us know what do you think were your greatest successes, notably in dealing with racial justice. So, somebody needs to mute while other people are speaking, I think.
Okay. So, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I think I was trying to think about that in terms of greatest successes. And one of the things that's hard to measure is that many of the reform measures that we've put in place are relatively new. But I think if there's a couple that I would want to highlight, the first would be in California, we had the opportunity through legislative changes to go back and to dismiss the convictions on the records of so many of our citizens for marijuana-related violations. And so we were very fortunate in California to be able to partner with an organization entitled Code for America, who really bring technology in to make government work for the people. And so it was our pleasure to join with them and pledge to dismiss thousands of old marijuana convictions that really stood in the way of people having access to so many resources in our community. Having a conviction on your record can keep one from being able to get adequate housing, to get student loans, and some have even had trouble going on field trips with their kids and to get jobs. And so I think this was a major success for us. We were able to dismiss thousands of old convictions that stayed on the records of people. Many people didn't even know they had the convictions on their record until they went, for example, to apply for a job or to some other resource. So that is one of the things that I would highlight that we were able to do within the past year that I think has been a great benefit to the citizens in Contra Costa County.
How many people were affected? Sorry. Approximately.
No, it's fine. I was going to say that going forward, there are so many things right now that we're doing, and I'm sure that as the program goes on, I'll have a chance to talk more about those.
Great. Thanks so much. So, Dan, you've been doing this for a long time, as I've said, and you've implemented what, we didn't call them reform programs back when you started. So can you talk about what you think has been most successful, particularly when you think about racial justice?
Sure. Thank you, Ellen. It's an honor to be here with this esteemed panel and my colleagues, Parisa and Dehghani, and who are very courageous people who ran as open and obvious reformers. And I kind of snuck in the back door. I've been in the office for 35 years. I was appointed chief of staff in 1990 and served for Norm Mailing, who was our prosecutor until his death in 2007. So back then, criminal justice reform meant going to the legislature and getting tougher sentences. And I was there in 1990 when our legislature did what lots of legislatures did when the crack cocaine hit our city, and we doubled and tripled our sentences. We filled our prisons. We tripled the size of our prison population, and at one point, about a quarter of the people there were there for drug offenses. Looking back at that, I don't know what we were thinking. That was terribly wrong, and we knew that there was racial disproportionality in the way that the people were being arrested and prosecuted. In fact, about 60% of people prosecuted for drug crimes in our region were people of color, and it might be about 6% of the general population. So we knew it, we saw it, and so when I got the honor to serve as the prosecutor, I wanted to begin to ramp down the war on drugs, and particularly the war on drug users. And when we use that term, and we don't use that term in our office like I'm going to war, but we know that that drug enforcement falls much harder on people who are people of color and people who are drug users. And so we, 9 years ago, began to build up a public health response to this behavioral health crisis that we have in Seattle, called the LEAD program, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. The idea was to get people connected to services rather than put them through the system. More than 2 years ago, I then took the next step, because I asked the question, and this is a question that everybody should ask their prosecutor when you go home: what really happens when you prosecute people for possessing tiny amounts of drugs? It's a felony in our state. For many years, we've put them in our misdemeanor court. But even then, it took a year to resolve. People spent 15 days in jail because of warrants. They didn't show up for court, so the court would issue warrants. Finally, they would plead guilty to a misdemeanor and we'd offer no help at all. So 2 years ago, I made the decision to no longer prosecute those cases. If you have under a gram, I always have the little Splenda pack, because people who don't use drugs don't know the metric system. So it's not a kilo, it's a gram. It's the tiniest amount. But if you have under that in my county and you get arrested for it, we're going to refer you to some services, and we're going to give you some counseling if you want it. But we're not going to run you through the criminal justice system. That's just the beginning. I think when we come out of this year, out of 2020, we have to be even bolder and look at the things that are going on in Oregon. It just passed an initiative that really codified the what I've been doing, but also is going to require a real investment of public funds, because it's not enough to just not prosecute. If you just don't prosecute and you walk away from the misery that is associated with rampant drug addiction, what's going to happen is that people are going to get frustrated, and then they're going to want the old thing back. They're going to want jail. They're going to want prison. They're going to want to double down on enforcement. So you have to not only not prosecute those cases, but you have to build up a public health response that can help people stabilize and do less harm to themselves and less harm to the neighborhood that they live in. So we're not done yet. We're just really getting started. But to me, that's the low-hanging fruit. When you talk to most people about drugs, most people will say, yes, drug addiction is a disease. And I agree, we can't prosecute our way out of it. We can't arrest our way out of it. Those are things that most reasonable people will agree with. But our policy hasn't caught up with those reasonable statements. We're still actively enforcing, using handcuffs instead of giving help, and convictions instead of connections. All the things that we know don't work, we continue to do. So I think coming into this next decade, especially with the backlogs that we're all facing, with the budget cuts, we can't afford to do drug cases anymore. We don't have room in our courts for them, and we know it doesn't help anybody. So it's time to be bold in that arena, and I want to continue to do that as long as I hold this office.
Okay, and we'll follow up on that as we go forward. Let's hear from Parisa. So what do you think has been most successful, particularly in dealing with systemic racism?
Thank you, first of all, for having this program, and the fact that we have the ABA talking about racial justice and racial and reform prosecutors, and how we can use our role to bring about racial justice is really an extraordinary testament to the hard work that folks like Dinah and Dan and Jamie have done for many, many years, and the work that activists have done. So I owe a debt of gratitude to everybody who came before me and paved the path for me to be here. So thank you. In terms of, we're 11 months into the administration, and we started out immediately by saying that we were not going to prosecute simple possession of marijuana because it was the worst case of discrimination that you could see in the system. We have a 9% population of Black Americans, and we had and 57% of the simple marijuana possession cases in Arlington County were of Black people. And I know, based on the way that my block smells, that it is not only Black people who are smoking marijuana. And so it's one of those historic examples of the usage rate is the same, but the consequences are very different depending on who you are, what your skin color is, what car you drive, and where you are in the legal system. So that was the first thing that we started doing. But we've done a lot more. We have a policy now where we disfavor peremptory strikes because they operate to disenfranchise Black people. And we're committed to making sure that, once juries come back after COVID, that a jury of your peers really means a jury of your peers, and that the system is more transparent to the community in that way, and that everybody has a fair opportunity to discharge their civic duty without discrimination. We have just received approval for our strategic plan to begin implementing restorative justice in Arlington, and we'll be sort of really implementing it next year. We've had some test cases, but the idea is to both bring a voice to victims who have not been heard and have not had as much autonomy in how their cases happen, and give them a chance to heal, but also give people who have done harm a chance to not only sort of interrupt their trauma and their trauma, but also to transform themselves and, ultimately reduce violence and ultimately reduce their involvement in the criminal legal system. We have been doing training frequently on various collateral consequences of conviction, from immigration to disenfranchisement, on trauma responses, and how, particularly for Black people, a lot of the responses that are viewed as suspicious or consciousness of guilt are actually trauma responses. And so that we recognize that as we're going through cases. And we've done a tremendous amount of advocacy with the legislature, from increasing our ability to divert more cases so that we can set the stage for restorative justice next year, We got decriminalization of marijuana, and which I supported, and we're moving towards legalization and regulation. We've changed the system so that judges are not going to be those, or judges can sentence people instead of jurors, which is going to actually sort of reduce the trial tax penalty for folks who go to trial. And we are working on mandatory minimums and expungement. But I think the most important thing of all is the fact that we've begun to we've begun to really discuss the false myth that has been perpetuated at the beginning to justify the enslavement of Africans, and then to justify more enslavement via the criminal legal system after abolition, and then to undo the gains of the civil rights movement. And so we're actually now starting to take a look at, retelling the story and retelling the origin story of the criminal legal system so that we can do better going forward and not replicate the disparities that already exist.
Parisa, when you talk about that kind of education, are you talking that internally within your office or in a broader community, including policing, including going out to the community to talk about these issues?
It's been internally so far, and I think it will be for a while longer. I am bringing together a community advisory board, and I'm hoping that community advisory board will be sort of the link to bringing these kinds of trainings into the community as well.
Thank you so much. So, Jamie, you've been looking at progressive prosecutors around the country, right? You're looking at the election of our new progressive prosecutors. Some are more reform-minded than others. I just wonder if you want to comment about other programs that you've seen elsewhere that you think are mostly successful in undoing systemic racism.
So thank you, Ellen. And I also just want to say how grateful I am to be in part of this. And Parisa gave me a little more credit. I still consider myself one of the new kids in this space just for the last 3 years. But I also want to acknowledge the leadership of April Kamara, the chair of the criminal justice section, who has made racial justice so central to the work of the criminal justice section this year, and how critical, clearly, these conversations are to the discussion of how we transform our system. And so, yes, my work is leading a national program where we're partnering with offices all over the country, and particularly offices, including DA Becton, who is a partner of ours, but including offices where the DAs have been elected on a platform of change, and specifically platforms that include ending mass incarceration, addressing racial disparities, and being more transparent and accountable to communities. I think, though, I probably push back a little bit on the premise of the question about successes in racial justice. I think we have seen lots of models across the country of different programs that work towards the goal of decarceration. I think a lot of what we just heard as examples are both sort of proactively, how do we sort of shut that front door and not bring things in that shouldn't come in. We've heard some examples of how do we retroactively address some of the harm that we know has been caused. But I think in terms of how we center racial justice in this work is something that is still in its very early stages. I think not only in the work of my program in the early stage, in the pilot phase, did we see, in spite of centering racial justice as a goal, and in the trainings that we did in our partner offices, ultimately using the data analysis that we used, we saw that racial disparities persisted. And that's not just our program. We've seen that in other decarceration efforts. So I think in terms of really thinking about how do we now push not just sort of decarceration, but how do we do things in a way that really address the harm that has been disproportionately carried by Black people and communities of color, requires this more intentional focus on these issues. And so one thing I'll mention, and I'm certain when we have a little bit more time in the conversation, I'd love to talk a little bit more about, is a recent initiative that we've launched, Motion for Justice, which was in response to seeing racial disparities persist in our work and bringing together racial justice scholars, lead prosecutors, those who have the lived experience and have been advocating for change, to come up with ways that we take the great things that we're seeing happening, but that we make sure that we're taking those things and intentionally focusing them on the communities that have been most impacted. So I think this whole national conversation that we're having it's as a result, really, of the tragedy of George Floyd's killing. You know, these conversations were happening in maybe smaller circles and certain silos, but I think we are at this incredible moment of opportunity where we are having these conversations on a much larger scale, where there is an opportunity for us to do the reckoning that we've never done as a country with our legacy of slavery, with the insidiousness of white supremacy that impacts all of us. So I think, there are probably few successes we can point to, but I think we are beginning to do the hard work now to get to that point.
Thank you so much. So I noticed in addressing what you're talking about, Pam, that there's such a pushback, particularly against African American women who are prosecutors. I mean, you can look around the country at the women who have been criticized, including Dinah, Kim Fox, Kim Gardner. So there's that contradiction there. Dinah, do you want to talk about how difficult that is? Because it's not just that you're dealing with communities that accept Jammy's premise, right? You have other people out there pushing from the other side, other constituencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we have a lot of challenges that you've already mentioned in the criminal justice system, and a big part of it is that as progressive prosecutors, we're taking on a difficult task of trying to fight against this systemic racism and all the inequities in our communities that have existed for many, many, many years. But we're also taking on the task of fighting an oppressive system while we're still, a part of it. And, we have this tremendous amount of power that we, as prosecutors, yield. And so for so long, prosecutors have been tough on crime, but we have contributed ourselves to this issue of mass incarceration, and certainly to the issue of racial inequities in our system. And we have to begin to recognize that the traditional way that we've done things has contributed to the mass incarceration in our country. And so as we begin to push reform platforms, that the kinds of things that you've already heard us talk about today, we are still, I think it is important to say that we're still committed to public safety, but we're also committed to tackling racial inequities in our system and reducing mass incarceration. And you mentioned the pushback, though, and that is something that I think we all have to recognize and talk about, because despite the fact that there has been a steady decline in crime rates, there are still critics who attack us in many, many different ways, both inside of our offices and outside of our offices, who are opposed to the reforms. We get claims that we are now a threat to public safety. So here we are still, with keeping public safety in the forefront of our minds. It is claimed that we are a threat to public safety and that we are compromising the rights of victims. And I think this is the message that we have to be very clear about, is that we are going to put in place these policies that can try to turn back the tide of inequities, especially racial inequities, because we know from the statistics that there has been a disparate impact on communities of color, and particularly on the Black communities. And so it is our role, because we're not just people who push cases through the system. It is our role to be aware of the wholeness and the health of our entire community. And so I think even though we go forward, we know that we get the pushback from so many different parts of our community, those in our offices who are accustomed to the old way of doing things, pushing practices and policies that have led us to this place of mass incarceration and inequitable treatment in our system. So that pushback comes from the inside, and it also comes from the outside. There's people who have pushed the law and order policies for so long that have led to the disparate impact in our communities. And so we push forward. Yes, we get threats. We get death threats against our life. We get attacks on us saying that we are compromising public safety. But I think we can rely on the data that shows that we are changing things and we are continuing to keep our community safe. And so we push forward, even though we know that those threats against what we're doing are out there.
And I hear this, it's really brave. I mean, I know of death threats against numbers of progressive prosecutors. But one of the issues that you mentioned, Diane, I think I'd like to follow up on is, what do we mean by public safety? When I started this, I was talking about people looking to changing the narrative about what we mean as public safety. So I'm wondering, Dan or Parisa, if you're involved in that effort. Parisa, you want to start?
Go ahead, Parisa.
Oh, no, I'm happy to let you go.
That's a hard one. I know it is.
Let me try it from this angle. Part of public safety is building confidence in communities that are impacted by crime, that if they see a crime or if there's a victim of a crime, that they should trust our system, that they should call 911, knowing that that's going to bring an armed police response, knowing that if they talk to the police, that then the prosecutor is going to subpoena them. And we ask witnesses and victims to do an awful lot to be involved in our system, and they don't get a lot out of it, to be honest. So part of building that confidence, to me, is to invest in the community that we serve and bring them into our work. And so we have always diverted a lot of cases to community groups to work on accountability, to define accountability themselves. This year, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the desire, at least in Seattle, for our government to fund more community capacity, we've got about a $10 million new item for community nonprofits to apply for money to receive from my office 1,000 adult felony cases. I pledged to send 1,000 people. I know I said cases, but they're really people, into the community who are facing their first felony, because we know that once you get your first felony, that the collateral consequences slam harder to get a job or an apartment or a student loan. And so we want to give the community a chance to work with these people before they get that felony on their record. But when the case they've been arrested, the case has been sent to my office, we're going to send it to the community. So building up community capacity is one way that I think we increase public safety, because the community members who are now being entrusted to define accountability and working with people who've offended against the law, they're going to have, I think, a greater sense that we can be trusted, that we are partners, that we're on the same team. But you can't force public safety. You can't intimidate people into public safety. You have to do it as a collective thing. And if there's anything good that's come out of this year, and there's not many, but for me, it is the new money that we can use to build community capacity, and my pledge to send 1,000 adult felony cases into the community for them to work their magic. Now, let me just say, the one thing that we're doing that's, I think, unique is using some of our money to take care of victims who have lost something in those crimes. It's always been restitution has been the thing that's disqualified us from sending cases out. Well, if we're gonna satisfy with public money the losses, out-of-pocket losses that victims have suffered, so that I think victims will be happier with that, getting that right away rather than waiting 2 or 3 years for a person to get a conviction and then maybe start paying a few dollars a month. Instead of that, we're going to take care of the victim losses immediately, and then bring the community into our work and say, here, you define accountability. And I think it's going to be a lot more satisfying than having somebody stand in front of a judge with a public defender and get a conviction on their record, which we know just leads to more convictions on the record.
So, Dan, it's commendable, and I think it's a good reform measure. I want to push back a little, and I want to say, why should these matters even come to the prosecutor in the first place, right? I mean, why are these prosecution issues? Why, for instance, if a person is charged with theft, felony theft, or felony drug possession, or has a mental health issue, why don't we have community resources where the money goes directly there and they deal with the problem first and they define what ought to be done, rather than think it's a policing problem that ends up in the prosecution's office? I think when we look at ways that of really engaging in transformative change, Those are the kinds of issues people are talking about. Particularly, I know April did an incredible job the other night on a program talking about going to the community, asking the community what they want, rather than having it come from the prosecution.
I mean, I agree with that. Oh, sorry, Dan, I didn't mean to step in.
No, go ahead.
I mean, I agree with that. And that's one of the reasons why when I talk about what we're doing in Arlington with the restorative justice program, we have a piece of it is going to be in schools, a piece of it is going to be in the community, and a piece of it is going to be in the legal system. And the hope with that is that the schools will capture, in RJ, the sort of disciplinary things that would have gotten kids expelled, or suspended, and sort of like stop the school to prison pipeline there. In the community, the idea is that, people won't have to call the police every time there's like a fight or, there's a disagreement or a conflict that isn't, very, very serious, that they'll have another option. And then the legal system is, hopefully will be reserved for the more serious cases. Because everything else has already gone to a more restorative process before it even gets to the court involvement and the prosecutor involvement. And so in some of the reforms that we're trying to do, I think we're all trying to shrink the size, the sort of scope of our offices. And I know that, they're trying to do that with the CAHOOTS program in Oregon. I know that the co-responder programs that are probably going to end up coming to Arlington as well are trying to do that. So there is a movement to do that. It happens to be that I think that the prosecutors are the ones that are sort of trying to push those cases and those problems back into the community so that the community can handle them in the more appropriate ways, because they just become bigger and multiply when they get into the criminal legal system.
Dan, did you want to respond? Dan, are you frozen? Uh-oh. Oh, no.
I'm sorry.
Did
Who
you
are you calling on?
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you wanted to respond to my pushback. Sure. Yeah, to the pushback.
Okay. So what we're talking about is stolen car cases, maybe an identity theft case where someone's stolen your person using your credit card. Those things are technically felonies, and the police are going to investigate those cases. And I don't want the police to, I'm not asking them to do anything different. They're going to bring us the case, and then we're going to decide using the superpower of prosecutorial discretion that they shouldn't go into the court system, that instead we should send them to a well-funded community partner who's going to talk to that and really be connections with that person, and I think have a much greater chance of persuading them to not commit new crimes. So it's going to save us money, but I think it's also going to build some community partnerships that will help us make an impact on public safety in the communities that are most impacted by.
So the pushback that I'm talking about, that Parisa was addressing, and Jamie, I want to hear you too, Jamie, is this whole idea is the prosecutor is gatekeeper. Why is the prosecutor a gatekeeper? Why are the police gatekeepers on so many of these problems that are social problems where everything is dumped in the prosecutor's lap? It shouldn't be like that. Jamie?
Yeah, so I think to your kind of original question about, does public safety need to be redefined, and why is so much coming into a system that is ill-equipped to address much of what's being brought to it, goes back to one, a need to sort of change the narrative from when we think public safety, so much of how we have built that narrative has been this sort of false dichotomy of bad people versus good people. And we have to have this sort of response to protect, us good people from the bad people, which we knowing really when we learn the history of how our system came about and how the system has been used to oppress and control Black people, that bad people usually means people who are people of color, and that stems a lot of that disproportionate impact. So one point I want to make is we need to shift the narrative from for our communities we need to provide public safety. How about we focus on how do we make communities thrive? So that instead of reverting to that public safety language, let's talk about thriving communities and what are the key pieces to have communities thrive. And then the second piece is, again, we can't have these discussions, sort of divorced from that history. And so understanding, that the intentionality behind the disparities that we see were from the beginning, and having the conversations about how do we attack this at the root. And that requires, more, as much as it is great. Like, I don't want to discount many of the things that we're already hearing about. We need, as everyday decisions are being made that impact people's lives, we need to be pulling every lever we can. But while we're pulling those existing levers, we need to, in this moment, be doing serious re-envisioning, really a challenging of how we envision our system of justice, and thinking how, again, do we focus on what are the pieces? We're spending billions in carceral responses at the expense of education and healthcare and all the things we know that are needed to make communities thrive. So I think a big piece of this is a shift of the focus and of the goal, but then we can't do that without centering racial equity, because we can point to examples of communities where there's very little racial disparity, where those types of responses are promoted, where the community is sort of seen as more inclusive and more open to different responses because the community has very little diversity. So while we think about community thriving, we still have to do the deeper work of addressing the root of the racial disparities and reckoning with the legacy of slavery and white supremacy that we've never really done as a country.
Well, it's remarkable that we're having this conversation, as Parisa said before, in the ABA. It's incredible, right? No one would think about that. But most of what we're talking about now has to do with restorative justice on low-level offenses, low-level felonies. And I want to push on the issues of violence, because we don't do a very good job of dealing with the people who are being sent to prison for inordinate amounts of time, right? We don't really deal with violence. The number of guns in this country has skyrocketed. Apparently, the number of suicides has skyrocketed. Drugs and guns together are terrible. Murders, the homicides are still not as up significantly. But what do we do about that as we're talking about systemic racism and overcoming the biases long-standing? Dinah, do you want to start?
Sure.
I mean, a really hard question. So.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I think there's a couple of things. I think the first thing I want to focus on, though, in response to your question before I get to our adult population, is our youth. Because, I firmly believe that we really have to focus a lot of our attention on where we begin to push people into our criminal justice system, and that is certainly with our young people. And so it's one of the reasons why I'm very, very pleased that as part has really centered our work on reform as it relates to our youth prosecutions. We've been able to establish, with the help of a grant, we received $1 million grant to bring the first restorative justice diversion program for our young people to Contra Costa County. And I think what's really, really unique about our program is that we're not focusing on those lower level non-violent cases. We are really focusing on the cases that have victims involved. And so it gives us an opportunity to address a lot of the underlying issues, such as trauma and things that are going to keep our youth from being whole and productive members of our society. And it is a pre-filing program for us, so that once our youth are able to finish this particular program, which has, by the way, a very high success rate, then we do not file the criminal charges at all. So I think that's one of the ways that we begin. But I think the other part of it is that we have to look at the past harm that has already been done by our criminal justice system, which is another reason why we are also focused not only on where we bring cases into our system, but also we have an opportunity now through changes in our laws to be able to go in and take a look back at sentences that today we might consider to be not in the interest of justice, and to review those cases and then make recommendations to our court system for a more just and fair and equitable sentence. So that is another project that we are participating in. Those are cases where people are serving inordinately long sentences, like 50, 75 years or more in prison. And we now have that opportunity, given the lens that we have today, given the focus on racial inequities, and given the focus even on mental health issues. We now, as prosecutors, are taking those steps as well to go back to look at those long sentences and make recommendations that we think is fair and just and equitable in light of what we know today.
So, thank you. I mean, in terms of making recommendations on current cases, let's say it's a homicide, someone's convicted of intentional murder, they have long-standing mental health issues. Are your recommendations significantly different today in terms of amount of prison time than they would have been, say, 10 years ago?
I think because I don't think 10 years ago, to answer your question in the short form, yes, I think that they are. One of the things that we also have to recognize is that our criminal justice system was criminalizing many people at a very young age. So some of the people that we're reviewing might have received very lengthy sentences when they were 15, 16 years of age. And so we now have an opportunity to go back and look at cases like that as well. We know that the youth brain is not as developed at that age as it might be at the age of 26 or 27. And so if back, 15 years ago, a young person was sentenced to these very long sentences who's never had any treatment for the trauma that they may have suffered or mental health that they may have suffered, we can now go back and look at those cases as well and make those recommendations for a more just and equitable sentence.
Are there community resources? I mean, one of the questions is, so where's the money going to come from to reinvest in the community, particularly for people who have been previously traumatized? Is there prosecutors, and Dan, I know you're getting monies for programs, Parisa, you are as well. Is there obligation to go secure community programs and give them to the community to do that? Is that part of this, Parisa?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear half of the question.
Oh, so I mean, I just want you to address the same question essentially. But if in fact what we're doing, right, is the kinds of programs that Dinah is talking about, which is actually looking back on these cases where people's lives have been destroyed by being put through the system, is there a way in which once you personally or you, the prosecutor's office, rectify that previous conviction, there are community resources that prosecutors fund to help?
You're still cutting out a little bit, but I mean, the idea of divesting and reinvesting is really all about supporting the community programs and the support systems that actually will help people not only not get into trouble to begin with, but also to heal from the trauma that they've experienced that caused them to do harm. But so the idea is that you get more from your investment in the front end and in the re-entry end than you do in simply incarcerating people. And so if we sort of divest the money from the sort of retributive and carceral system that we have, we will be able to invest it in areas that actually have a better.
So I still want to deal with this question, what we do about like to talk about violent cases, right? What are we going to do about that?
All right. Well, let me try this. So, and to be honest, once somebody's been convicted of a murder, my options are pretty limited. I mean, they're going to go to prison, and they don't go for as long as we used to. I do believe, and we stole a law that had passed in California and helped pass it here in Washington last session that allows prosecutors to resentence somebody in the interest of justice. Because we were looking at cases from the 90s where long sentences were imposed. We don't have probation or parole in Washington. And so if the prosecutor didn't look at those cases, nobody was going to. And so we have developed a robust practice to go back and try to reconcile these older cases with what we would do today, and also to recognize people who've made that change. And it's really hard in prison to do that because there aren't that many ways to measure your reformation in prison. But one of the reasons to do that is that there are credible messengers. There are now adults in prison who could be a real asset in our community to talk to young people who are attracted to the violence lifestyle. And so, to me, we've been sending cases of young people who are possessing guns illegally, committing robberies, and also stealing cars. Those are things that we see leading to the use of guns and irreparable violence. We've been taking those young people and putting them with credible messengers, people who've had the lived experience, who can show them another way. I mean, to me, that's the only antidote, is to get there before they pull the trigger and to try to convince them that their life is worth something more and that they shouldn't define themselves by their next act of retribution for violence. And so violence interruption is a thing. We need to invest in it. We need to invest in credible messengers. Violence is entirely predictable because it's a disease. We've mapped it in our county. It's highly concentrated. 3 out of 4 people who were shot last year in my county were people of color. 3 out of 4 people who we charged with aggravated assault with firearms were people of color. We know where they live. We know what causes that, but we don't have a well-funded way to get in and stop it.
Well, if we did, let's say instead of prosecuting, Dan, some of those people, we had anti-violence programs run by the community, and the community decides whether or not they think the person should be prosecuted instead of you. I mean, you're doing a great job, but I'm just posing that as an option because that's the way in which many people are thinking about what we do about anti-violence programs.
When you establish partnerships with people in the community and you invite them in to do your work, they will have opinions about what you should do with individual cases, and we honor that and support that. But like I say, once somebody's been convicted of murder, all of a sudden my options are down to very few.
And can you just talk about the numbers? You said you're relooking at cases. I mean, there's some cynicism in the country right now about compassionate release and COVID. Because even though lots of jurisdictions talk about compassionate release, but as my colleague Abby Smith said the other day, people have forgotten the word compassionate. So few of these compassionate release petitions are actually granted. I think we may be talking federal more than state, but I think people often wonder about numbers in terms of prosecutors re-looking at cases.
So the ones that bothered me the most were the 3 strikes cases, because we gave young men life without possibility of release, the slow death penalty we were giving to men who were 25 years old back in the mid-90s when we passed this law. And they were 40 or 45, and so there was no one to look at them. So I've had about 25 of those cases where we've successfully argued for the release of somebody who'd been given an LWOP, and it's a start. We also have had individual cases that we've resentenced when we looked back at the sentence that was imposed and said, and I said I wanted to see every case where somebody got a 25-year sentence for a non-homicide. And how come? And you can kind of tell why, and you can start to undo that. So it is not in our nature to go look backwards. That's extra work. We got plenty of work coming in the door. But to me, that's part of what buys you some credibility with the community that you're trying to build trust with, is to say, I have an obligation to look backwards as well as to look forward, and to push for more funding for reentry programs so that when people are released from prison, they don't immediately fall back into the conditions that send them back. So we have to do both things. We have to shrink the size of the cases coming in, shrink that number, but we also have to stop the recidivism train by investing in people when they get back out. That's the only way we're going to focus the resources of our system on those most serious.
So, Tammy, when you think of this question of violence, what we do about that, what do you say to progressive prosecutors, or what is your thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I recommend is Until We Reckon, which was written by Danielle Sered. She runs Common Justice, which is a restorative justice program for violent crime cases out of New York. And one of the things that she talks about in this book is the research that we know about the drivers of violent crime. Like, they are documented. We know when they are present that you are going to see more violence, and their inability to meet one's economic needs, isolation, shame, and exposure to violence. And so the same communities where we know violence is centralized are the same communities that we know are under-resourced. We know they are food deserts. We know that all the things that would promote, again, shifting more to thriving communities are not in those places. And this, to me, again, is where history is really key in understanding these are intentional choices we've made about what communities we invest in and that we don't invest in. And, I give Jeff Robinson so much credit on this. If you've had a chance to see his amazing presentation that walks us through our history of racism in this country, one of the things he shows is the government made intentional decisions to resource new immigrants, when they came to this country, to give them land, to provide training on how to use that land, to create the colleges on that land. And so when making sure people had that ability to meet their economic needs, to make sure that there were resources put in to create community so that folks weren't isolated and just left to themselves to fend for themselves. But we do that for certain communities again. It's just if we can't get to that basic root of understanding the basic humanity and combating what has been the dehumanization of Black people and reckoning with that history to acknowledge we did this fine for white immigrants, but we certainly have never done it for Black people, that those same communities, if we would invest those kind of resources, that we can stop violence on the front end, in addition to all the important work that needs to be to address what's happened on the back end.
So, Percy, you're shaking your head. Yes, you agree. Would you like to add anything?
Oh, I don't think I could say it better than Jamie did, but if what she's talking about is really at the turn of the century, when in the so-called progressive era, when we shifted away from the biological determinism that said that where the premise was that Black people are more likely to commit crimes because of their biology, and moved into sort of explaining that people commit crimes because of their socioeconomic factors. But we applied that to, as Jamie said, we applied that to Jewish immigrants and Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants, and they committed crimes because of their socioeconomic circumstances, because they were poor, because they lacked access to education and resources. But the narrative persisted that Black people were different, and that this false narrative that Black people committed crimes at a disproportionate rate, which they didn't. That study was completely debunked. But the idea that the Blacks committed more crimes because their culture was bad, and I'm saying that in quotes, not because I'm characterizing it that way, but that's how it was characterized. And so, when we had this progressive era that was looking at things from this more enlightened perspective, what we got was, a more humane and a more enlightened, but still racist criminal legal system. And we can't reform that system by simply adopting neutral principles and hoping that those neutral principles and those neutral reforms are automatically going to eliminate racial bias in the system, because those biases, as Jamie said, didn't make it into the system by accident. They were built in, and they were built in consciously. And we have to do the work to unpack those false myths.
So many people who are prosecutors on this will say, of course, it's really important. Yes, everyone needs to be educated, but how do you translate that need for education into practical problems for the prosecutor? Because after all, many people will say the role of the prosecutor is to prosecute cases, right? That really is our fundamental problem. As I said to Dan before, if prosecution is going to be the gatekeeper, maybe we're just not going to be able to really solve it within this system. We have to develop some alternatives. Jamie, do you want to? We only have a few more minutes. We could talk for hours, I know, but.
Yes, I want to say it's a little bit of both. So I don't think the answers lie within the system. I do think we have to get outside of the system, but there's a firm recognition that every day the system is devastating lives. And so you have to also work for change within it while you are trying to aggressively rebuild a better approach. So because I worry that if we say, well, prosecutors, it's not on them, we've got to do this outside, that folks will throw up their hands and say, all right, it's not my responsibility. It absolutely is. And because we know there's so much power held within that office, but I want to sort of double down on Parisa's point about we can't then say we're going to fix it race neutrally. We have to be intentional about targeting, just as intentional as we've been as a country in causing the harm to Black communities and communities of color. We have to use the power, the influences, and importantly, the resources to be as intentional in rectifying that harm in those same communities. And I do think there are things prosecutors can do, and a lot that needs to be done outside of a prosecutor's office. There are just basic community resources that need to be in place, funding structures that need to be radically shifted. We're starting to see a little bit of that now, but it needs to happen at a much larger rate. But it does not absolve prosecutors from playing a role.
Okay, everybody's got to play their role, right? Which is partly why we have so many reform prosecutors, and you're all engaging in these pretty remarkable programs, notably education of the people within your system. You know what? It's 5 o'clock. We have not yet talked about sort of an elephant in the room, which is policing, right? And that probably is a program unto itself. But I don't know if anybody wants to end on that. Like what I wanted to talk about. What do you do? You're a reform prosecutor. You don't necessarily have reform police, and you have to work with them. They are the people who are, bringing you cases, being your witnesses, etc. What do we do about that? Anyone want to end on a comment on that before I thank you all and they end our program for us?
Yeah, I would love to be able to at least mention that there really has to be, we have to end the unhealthy entanglement that we have between police unions and district attorneys. I think that is really extremely important. That's why I have taken the pledge, along with other prosecutors, that we will not seek or accept political or financial support from law enforcement unions. It's because prosecutors, we're in a very unique position. We have to work very closely with law enforcement every single day. And simultaneously, though, we also have to evaluate whether crimes have been committed by those same officers when those cases come to us. And so when we have received the endorsement of the entities who are funding the defense for those officers who are being investigated, it really does create an appearance, at a minimum, of a conflict of interest for elected prosecutors, and really lessens the trust that the public can have in the decisions that we make. And so I think that it is important for us, this is my opinion, but I think it's very important for us, those prosecutors who are seeking election, to consider not accepting political or financial support from law enforcement unions, and reduce that presence of the possibility of a conflict of interest, and also to ensure the independence on the part of prosecutors when we have to conduct these investigations.
Thank you very much, Diana. Final words. I'm not sure they're going to end this session for us, or we end it ourselves. I'm not really sure, but Dan?
I thank you for having us. I just want to say, you said that the prosecutor's job is to prosecute cases. I think it's also to not prosecute some cases when we know that we do more harm than good. And we have to, you have some humility. A little bit of humility goes a long way in this work to go, are we making things worse or are we fixing something? And so the discretion that we have to decide whether or not to file a charge is fundamental, is critical. It really is our superpower if we're going to make changes in our respective.
So thank you so much, Dan. Jamie?
I just want thank you for being here. Grateful for April and her leadership, and to have the ABA focused on these critically important issues. And of course, have to promote our Motion for Justice initiative. If you are looking for concrete action steps to take as prosecutors, particularly those in partnership with community, please check out motionforjustice.org. Thank you.
Jamie. Parisa?
I'll just piggyback on what Dan said, which is about the role of prosecutors. It's not, I don't think it's to prosecute cases. We're more than widget makers. If our job is to do justice, then our job is to have the racial reckoning. And right now is the time to do that.
Well, thank you. I was just being provocative, of course, because I don't think that is your job. I think you are ministers of justice. And yes, we can make progress. And I just want to thank you all. You're inspirational in terms of the work that you're doing. And so on behalf of the Criminal Justice Section, thank you all for this wonderful program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is not Zoom, so I don't know how we end this.